We're going to talk Volt Typhoon. This is research, largely open source based or whatever, so this could be replicated for anyone who wants to follow along, but that I've been working on for a couple of years across 3 different companies now, which is a little awkward to say, but so it goes if you know who I am and where I've been. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today is Volt Typhoon in the context of the so what part of Volt Typhoon. One of those things where there's been lots of discussion, but not a whole lot of evidence or of impact or other observations around what the point is. Who am I? I'm Joe Slowik. You're here to listen about Volt Typhoon, not talk about me. So I work at Data currently, where I'm directing cybersecurity alerting strategy, and I've worked other places. That's all we need to talk about for that. Let's get on to our agenda. What is a Volt Typhoon? This actually will tie in nicely with the keynote today from Dimitri as far as like Volt Typhoon as a construct and what that means. We'll then get into OT disruption types, that what would the options available to a Volt Typhoon be if we are hypothesizing that Volt Typhoon is an entity that is preparing for or will enable a future cyber-physical operation of some sort. We'll then examine the current state of Volt Typhoon. This entity has been around for a few years at this point, so what are they doing today? What do we see from them today? And then finally discuss some projected Volt Typhoon actions and operations that get into what that cyber-physical impact may be. So first off, what is a Volt Typhoon? It is a cryptonym that has been assigned to a set of activity. That's all great, but what does it stand for? I'm going to assume, since we're at CYBERWARCON, that pretty much everyone in this room has probably read an article or two on Volt Typhoon. If you haven't, that's okay, but I do encourage you. This research has been written up in a paper, which I'll provide a link for at the very end here. So if you really want to dig deep into the historical analysis, stay tuned. But effectively, Volt Typhoon is a People's Republic of China linked threat actor that has a history of targeting critical infrastructure entities, largely in the United States, although for those who were paying attention, there was a notification from, or a public statement from Australian intelligence on Volt Typhoon or similar activity targeting Australian critical infrastructure over the last several years as well. Volt Typhoon has been hypothesized as an entity involved in a 2027 Taiwan scenario. Very briefly, there is an assessment based upon public comments from the PRC leadership that there is a need for the People's Liberation Army and other elements to be ready to invade Taiwan no later than 2027. Doesn't mean they're going to in 2027, important distinction, but to be ready by then. And so you often hear this referred to as a 2027 scenario. So Volt Typhoon would step in as a cyber component to assist that invasion in the sense of deterring or defeating the capability of the United States to intervene on Taiwan's behalf should such an invasion occur. But what's important to note about Volt Typhoon, and we'll come back to this repeatedly throughout this discussion, is that there's no publicly known impacts to US critical infrastructure key resources or critical national services at this time. So lots of talk about Volt Typhoon intrusions, but unlike what we've seen with an Indestroyer or other sorts of things that have taken place over the years, or use of wipers and networks like in Ukraine and similar, there's no disruptive scenario that has been linked to Volt Typhoon action. It's just lots of access, intrusions, and potentially data gathering. Okay, so Volt Typhoon, I think I'm obliged to throw this up there since I used to work with Sergio Caltagirone, and now I do work with Andy Pendergast over in Data Threat Connect land. A quick diamond model mapping that it's important to note as part of this, and again, linking this to the keynote, Volt Typhoon stands as a construct in the sense that it is linked to PRC operations, but is not assigned to any known or specific PRC-related group. So unlike looking at entities that have been linked to some division of the Ministry of State Security or some other concrete entity in the overall PRC zoo of cyber actors, Volt Typhoon is just kind of out there, although it appears that it's probably military linked, so strategic support force or similar, but no public evidence for that yet. In terms of capabilities, Volt Typhoon is a royal pain in the ass in that they largely hew towards living off the land techniques and similar mechanisms with a little bit of not custom tooling, but non-standard tooling sprinkled in for good flavor and such, like fast reverse proxy and some other entities. Infrastructure-wise, the group is very well associated with the use of proxy networks, my preferred term. You may be more familiar with that in the sense of ORB networks, operational relay boxes, but relying on networks of compromised devices in order to proxy traffic from Volt Typhoon infrastructure to ultimate victims. with that victimology largely being US-centric, but again, more recent comments indicating that this is perhaps much wider across the greater Pacific region. The significance of Volt Typhoon is that Mr. Christopher Wray, may his law enforcement career rest in peace now, that stated while he was still FBI director that this is the most critical thing that we're dealing with from a cyber perspective with respect to critical national infrastructure. Similarly, Alex Stamos, he's not here, is he? Okay, good. Had this rather inflammatory comment of Volt Typhoon being like if you wanted to win World War III on a day one scenario, that this is sort of what you would have to do in terms of pre-positioning, data gathering, et cetera. So very concerning thoughts from some pretty smart people that are in the know to various degrees on these sorts of matters. Yet still for all of that, there's a whole lot of smoke, but no identified fire behind it in terms of seeing an actual impact from Volt Typhoon. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we translate Volt Typhoon operations, which are very concerning given what they're targeting, into impacts, the things that really make us care? Because the transitioning operations from current access development and information gathering to action requires an understanding of what's going on, but we can at least ascertain based on who Volt Typhoon has compromised over the years, power authorities in the island of Guam, West Coast port installations that would be associated with the movement of material in support of a Taiwan scenario, as well as some other entities, that this entity is very much interested in physical infrastructure or the information assets associated with physical infrastructure, thus giving us the assessment that Volt Typhoon is in some sense involved in preparing for a cyber physical impact scenario. But what does a cyber physical impact scenario look like? Well, let's talk about that in terms of operational technology disruption types. The thing is that we have three general options that map to our CIA triad, for those of you that unfortunately have CISSPs in the room, that we have the general confidentiality, availability, and integrity. What's interesting about this is that from an OT perspective, we largely have an emphasis on availability targeting as being the most important. Let's walk through these at a high level to see just what they mean effectively, because this does serve as a useful way of translating what OT operations can do for impacting in a cyber physical sense, and some examples of what they've looked like. So confidentiality attacks, largely in the sense of loss of information or bringing information out of an environment, involves getting into the OT environment in some sense, which is a non-trivial item for some cases, very trivial in others if you're hanging PLCs off the internet and can find them in your daily Shodan Safari. But either way, the idea is that to identify information of interest within that environment, whether from an asset itself, a accumulation point like a data historian or licensing server or similar, and to grab the ground truth information for how that OT environment is set up and exfiltrate that information for reasons. Could be for an enhanced version of industrial espionage. It could be because I need to pull the precise software, hardware, firmware, and software versions for a given asset in order to develop a capability to deploy against it in order to have a future disruptive scenario. And the thing is, we've seen this outside of just stealing secrets for the sake of doing so historically, in activity like the Berserk Bear campaigns from a decade ago, well, operating for a long time after that as well, where we saw a threat actor that was not really tied to any disruptive or known disruptive activity, but very much was interested in penetrating many industrial environments, critical infrastructure environments, gathering lots of data and potentially organizing some degree of pre-positioning. The key point to this is that if we map OT-based or cyber-physical intrusions to the cyber kill chain, in this case linking the cyber kill chain to the Purdue reference architecture model, which is a model, not a security architecture. If I confuse that, there's going to be some OT whatever mafia that'll crucify me for it. But anyway, the idea being is that in order to progress from an IT intrusion and to have the capabilities necessary for OT impacts, I need to have the data necessary, the information about my target to have an effective payload to deliver for that environment, which based upon a variety of criteria will often be relatively custom for that entity. So in looking at this, it's almost always the case that some degree of confidentiality impact must be achieved in order to enable anything else. That short of doing something like we'll talk about here in a moment, like deploying a Windows-based wiper or some other capability in an OT environment, which would be technically trivial but quite disruptive, any sort of really interesting effect that involves the manipulation of a process in an interesting way, leading to outcomes like cyber disruption or destruction, is going to involve having some target-specific knowledge to make that a possibility. Which gets us to availability impacts. What we often think of as being the most common and the most critical way of disrupting OT environments, where I access that environment, deploy some capability that inhibits functionality, stop a process, wipe a computer, deploy ransomware, which is something that we need to worry about these days. And then as a result, we disrupt industrial operations or critical infrastructure operations. Seems pretty straightforward, and honestly, it kind of is. Because if we look at that, availability attacks need not be OT aware, and that I can target IT systems and their dependencies. There's an awful lot of Windows and standard operating systems that are operating in or upon which critical infrastructure depends for their operation, including lots of legacy unsupported versions of Windows and versions of Linux. You'd probably be scared to see what's actually running out in these environments. You can deploy wipers like we've seen in Ukraine and as we've seen historically in events like Shamoon in these environments in order to basically wipe out the IT layer on which OT depends and inhibit process control, inhibit the ability to operate that environment effectively. Examples of this include ransomware, not OT-specific ransomware, but just Windows-based ransomware that happens to find itself in an industrial environment, wipers, even things like denial of service activity, that if I've overloaded a communication pathway and can no longer send legitimate commands, I've produced an availability impact on that asset. These can directly, if it's within the industrial environment, or indirectly, thinking about a colonial pipeline scenario where I haven't actually touched anything OT related, but I have impacted IT operations in such a fashion that I'm no longer confident in my ability to accurately and safely operate that industrial infrastructure, thus leading to a self-impact scenario where I'm shutting down the network as a result of caution. So in looking at these scenarios, an availability impact leads to service disruption. That can be very useful for temporary interruptions or for targeted environments, that I specifically want to take out this substation. I want to make sure that this factory is inhibited in some fashion. However, there's a limited capability, and I put an asterisk on there because it really depends on what your incident response and recovery plan looks like in terms of long-term disruption or destruction. So what are we looking at in terms of these sorts of events? Well, we can go back to 2015 for the first Ukraine power incident, which really at its heart was an availability disruption in terms of opening breakers, detonating things on the way out for the serial to Ethernet converters that allowed for operation of those assets, at least in a ICS sort of fashion, which produced an immediate disruption in operations, one which the asset owners were able to overcome because they shifted to manual operations. Significantly inconvenient and had repercussions in recovery and such, but leading to a limited outage only at the specific sites that were impacted. The Jaguar Land Rover event from a few months ago, not necessarily OT targeting in nature, at least based upon what available evidence has come out, which is not complete so far, but this ransomware event effectively destroyed factory and manufacturing operations for a prolonged period of time based upon an availability impact at the IT layer. So we could look at an OT targeting scenario as a form of wiping out our ability to operate these assets for a period of time until we're able to apply some mitigating factors or get into manual mode of operations. Finally, and arguably most interesting, for something that I talked about the last time I was at CYBERWARCON about 5 years ago, so it's been a while, integrity attacks. Here, we're talking about modifying fundamental aspects of the process in question within the industrial environment. This modification to safety, protection, or similar allows unintended or undesirable functionality to propagate beyond safety and protection layers in order to enable something like a physically destructive scenario, removing those very factors within an environment that allows for the manufacturing, the utility, etc. Operation to function safely and to remain within known safe bounds. If we're mapping this out, we can look at this version of a graphic that some very few people in the room may actually be familiar with, that if we look at regular operations of industrial environments, that we have various layers that we can progress through in terms of system recovery when something bad happens. That can be operator intervention as we start moving into more automated fashion, the use of things like safety instrumented systems, protective relays in electric environments and similar that step in automated fashion to recover an environment before it gets into a bad state, all the way up to physical mitigations and engineering controls like blowout valves and pressure release valves and similar that step in, although at a place that we don't really want to get to because it starts becoming more and more expensive to recover the higher up this stack we move, all the way up to something like the plant exploded and we're relying on a dike in order to make sure that we're not spilling chemicals into the river, or something equally horrific, which has likely resulted in physical damage, if not actually loss of life, environmental damage, and similar. The idea here is that for these attacks to succeed and to migrate more towards the top of this image, we need to wipe out that salmon-ish color, kind of in the middle of automated safety controls, modify the integrity of the environment that allows for the preservation of safety. So in thinking about this, integrity targeting or integrity removal is a necessary precondition to enabling meaningful cyber-physical impacts. Basically, if you're not addressing this, your wonderful cyber weapon tool, whatever the hell you want to refer to it as, is going to be inert because safety controls are going to step in and make sure that the worst case scenario doesn't happen. Process protection, safety, and other measures must be degraded or removed to enable some sort of effect to take place. We don't see a whole lot of this, but we've seen attempts and one success. So we've seen an attempt in the form of the Triton event from 2017. Didn't really work. This is a discussion for the bar later if you want to have it or whatever, but an attempt to target process safety to enable some effect that we don't know quite what it was because it didn't work. And then I don't think it's been mentioned yet today, so I get to break the taboo and mention the S word. Stuxnet was at its core an integrity event because it targeted process monitoring as well as process control to enable the effect to propagate beyond operator and system intervention to allow for a destructive payload to succeed. Okay, so how the hell does all this relate to Volt Typhoon? Joe, you're taking us down a pathway of which I don't understand. Well, let's talk about the current state of Volt Typhoon first, of where we are right now. So you may have read an article in the Record a few months ago that Ms. Christina Walter, who I think was, to their credit, was not maybe quoted fully or whatever, but made a comment to the effect of like, Volt Typhoon, we defeated them, right? Like, well, okay, greater context, not really. There's still lots of discussion, lots of concern around Volt Typhoon, or at least what a Volt Typhoon as a construct, as a PRC-based entity that is targeting critical infrastructure for the purpose of prepositioning for a disruptive effect down the line. So maybe Volt Typhoon, in terms of the specific campaigns that have been identified previously, like actions in Guam, have been identified, maybe not defeated, but there's still things going on today. Because the objective of Volt Typhoon remains, even if the nature of the implementing behaviors to achieve those objectives have been altered in some fashion. So Volt Typhoon behaviorally may shift and evolve in response to defender actions over time, but the objective that the People's Republic of China was almost certainly going to want to preposition in US critical infrastructure for purposes of preparation for a future conflict, I don't see that going away anytime soon. Furthermore, all available evidence from people I talk to, and unfortunately, some of this is not public, so will not be shared in this environment today, indicates that the activity is ongoing, whether we're talking about utilities, we're talking about opportunistic targeting of electric utility co-ops and similar, some of which may be targeted, others of which appear to be very opportunistic, as well as expansions of activity into the oil and gas sector, all strongly indicate that this actor remains operating and doing so in ways that are quite concerning. So with that said, what would we expect from a Volt Typhoon? Okay, the big scary thing in the room or whatever, that's great that they're getting into these environments, but for what reason? What can we anticipate, knowing what we know now from a very brief thumbnail sketch of this activity in terms of enabling actual OT disruption? Let's talk about some projected Volt Typhoon actions. Based upon what we know from open source reporting, comments in the media and such, what can we assess that a Volt Typhoon would do, or at least would be capable of doing? So I largely look at this as bifurcating between two general options. Specific outages, specific targeted actions against infrastructure of interest, so targeting a specific entity for disruption, almost certainly in conjunction with other actions. So think about a Taiwan invasion scenario, and I want to prevent the United States from being able to effectively launch aircraft from the island of Guam, or to ship military material from the western part of the United States to the Western Pacific, et cetera. So looking for very specific entities linked to very specific functions and degrading or disabling them in some fashion. On the other hand, especially in light of more recent targeting, there is this option, which is referred to in Mr. Ray's comments that I mentioned earlier, of widespread chaos. A Volt Typhoon not being a targeted element as much as an element that is trying to hold assets at risk, in this case, the US economy, by being able to target and impact multiple parts of that economy roughly simultaneously at a time of the PRC leadership choosing. This would require multiple points of presence simultaneously to execute widespread operations to maximize economic disruption. Thinking about rolling blackouts across the Eastern Interconnect, or impacting water utilities at the 10 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, or something similar. Not necessarily specific in terms of what's being targeted or what is being acted upon, but so widespread in nature that it would be impossible to ignore and inflict immense amounts of pain on the US, such as to provide either a deterrent or certainly a very strong response effect towards any US action that the PRC is attempting to respond to or prevent from taking place. So in thinking about targeted operations, these are impacts delivered to specific facilities for a very specific purpose. These would likely be timed or extended disruption aligned with military or other goals, like I referenced earlier. An example of this we've probably already seen with what originally brought Volt Typhoon to light in Microsoft's reporting from a couple of years ago in terms of targeting electric utilities on the island of Guam, as well as suspected activity targeting port operations in the western United States. Very specific assets that were of specific interest based upon what they are, what they do, what purposes these entities serve to inhibit those follow-on functions like military response from military installations on Guam, or the ability to ship resources from the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, et cetera. So that's concerning and arguably something that needs to be addressed, but represents something that is much more circumscribed in nature. Arguably a little more concerning is this potential widespread chaos scenario, which seems to have emerged as an alternative scenario for Volt Typhoon over the last couple of years, where we see my poorly formatted slide, thanks to the conversion from Google to PowerPoint, saying indiscriminate and opportunistic targeting, just going after whatever I can reach, and trying to acquire as many points of presence as possible for that impact to be as widespread. Not thinking about what specifically is impacted in these cases, but rather just trying to inflict as much pain as possible. And we've seen examples of this. So the Register had an article a year ago now, I think. No, not that long ago, but several months ago, about a small utility in the Northeast in Massachusetts area, Littleton Electric Light Water District. I'm probably bungling that right now, but anyway, small electric and water co-op. There's very little of strategic value associated with that. I've talked through some scenarios with people. There's some interesting elements of transmission infrastructure that flow through that utility's territory, but end of the day, ain't no one care about Littleton from any big geostrategic perspective. Yet Volt Typhoon was there, and was there to a non-trivial degree, as well as other electric co-ops beyond ones that are serving things like missile silos in North Dakota to just any entity that the Volt Typhoon operators are able to gain access to. So this is concerning because it implies that Volt Typhoon is looking for anything that they can touch, anything that they can get access to for capability development or future disruptive scenario deployment for widespread economic impact. And if you're thinking about that from a national command authority perspective, that is a risk that becomes certainly strategically very significant, but also politically significant very quickly if you start seeing widespread outages to power, water, and similar throughout the entire country due to an indiscriminate attack scenario. Now, in looking at this, it's important to note that disruptive attacks targeting availability can be effective for point-in-time disruption for specific targets, or if I layer enough of these on together, for widespread cascading impacts. So I'm talking about capabilities that don't have to be as targeted in a technical sense, but also aren't going to be as long-lasting either, which if I'm just trying to make sure that I'm buying myself a 24 or 48-hour window for military operations, or if I'm targeting so much infrastructure simultaneously, will likely lead to follow-on impacts and have a force multiplier associated with it. If I want to progress towards destruction, however, that requires integrity impacts, and this gets pretty hard pretty fast, which is why we've only seen one successful example of this in the last 20 years of tracking cyber operations with a cyber physical component to them, the nasty S word again. This is much harder to achieve in scale in trying to progress beyond or inhibit that safety layer. And it's likely only applicable for specific site targeting if I want to take that site out for a long time. thinking about ways to ensure that that power plant goes down, or this transmission substation burns out the transformers or something like that, which is going to take significantly amounts of time to replace and recover. So in evaluating these, a likely Volt Typhoon scenario, question mark, because we have a lot of unknowns here, is that Volt Typhoon is going to continue doing what they're doing right now in breaking into networks, gathering information, harvesting credentials, cementing themselves into the victim environment. And then in terms of near-term actions, if they haven't done this already, which is an open question and is indeterminate in some of the public reporting, of migrating beyond the significant amounts of IT access they've already been able to establish into OT access to gather more specific information about environments for capability development. However, while that capability development could extend into site-specific tooling to launch a Triton that works or an in-destroyer that works or similar, the possibilities for either wide indiscriminate disruption or specific point destruction mean that I'm looking at what Volt Typhoon's been doing in terms of initial access lately over the last year and a half, 2 years. In my assessment, the evidence supports the group has shifted from trying to do very targeted operations like we saw in Guam to more of the widespread targeting the economy impact, which means the barrier for entry for Volt Typhoon in terms of capability development has gotten much lower. They need to develop a wormable wiper functionality and get it into OT environments and detonate them roughly simultaneously in order to have the desired effect. But there are unknowns, critical unknowns, not the least of which being is that certainly Volt Typhoon operations are necessary precursors to almost any OT attack scenario, but what kind of scenario remains an open question? Disruption or destruction, targeted or opportunistic? We don't have good information. We can assess some things based upon what we've seen as far as the group's operations, and the nature of recent, last year or so, Volt Typhoon operations suggests an emphasis on opportunistic targeting, but it's based on incomplete information, at least as we talk about items that are available for public disclosure and public discussion. So to conclude this, as I run out of time, one way or another, based upon just the nature of the world right now, which is kind of a scary place at the moment, there will be a persistent PRC interest in obtaining long-term access to US critical infrastructure, even if the ways of doing so shift. So again, Volt Typhoon at the end of the day is a proxy. It is a collection of behaviors and techniques that we've bundled together and given a name. That may go away, not because we've defeated it, but because they've changed things as a result of disclosure and our ability to respond to those items. So Volt Typhoon may very well disappear, but it's going to reemerge as an item just because the strategic foundation upon which gave rise to Volt Typhoon operations in the first place is not going away. So from a defender's perspective, we need to be mindful of and continuing to track this activity to see how Volt Typhoon evolves in response to disclosure, defender response, and similar. So like I said, there is a paper associated with this. You can trust me, but trust me, I'm a very nice guy, and use that QR code and that it is not going to take you to a Rickroll or 10 hours of Heman saying, hey, yeah. Or you can use the direct link to this paper that my marketing department is going to be enraged at for me because this bypasses the CAPTCHA portal, and just go right to the paper itself. So there's only a minute and a half left. Yep, thank you. Okay.